This job we need a chair and a pen and your brain. I mean, that's really all. You don't need any stuff. You don't need any staff, depending on where you work, but you can just be, you can just do you.
You learn about so many other worlds. That certainly each patient lives in their own world, and you get to inhabit it. And I find that endlessly satisfying.
The art of psychiatry is that we have to have another dimension to how we see patients and how we interact with patients, how we gather information, how we diagnose.
And what sort of surprised me was the role of therapy, and it's not just medications. There's a science behind the power of words. There's a science behind listening.
I was part of a whole harm reduction community in the days when, giving syringes out to people who were injection drug users was considered to be inappropriate. And so I realized I was a person with these sort of edgy social justice ideas, and unless I had a degree and some social standing to back me up, that I wouldn't be able to get very far with those ideas for very long. And that was the point. And people supported that idea that if I were to be successful and go to medical school, that I could, then do work, the kind of work that I wanted to do. And it's sort of worked out. Didn't look exactly the way I thought it would look.
If you look at the etymologic roots of the term psychiatry, it's being a doctor to the soul, healer of the soul.
Why did you become a psychiatrist? It needs to be in there somewhere.
I think that was one of the
That's key.
cores.
That's core. Who's circling these?
Oh, I'm writing them on
Oh, good.
up here so we can see them all together. Okay, so what led you to? How did you? What led you to become a psychiatrist?
Why did you become a psychiatrist? Everybody can put that in their own words.
Why?
We have some expertise in taking a history, but we take a psychiatric history. The big picture of what we're hoping to achieve here is to get a cohesive narrative of what it means to be a human being and this experience of being a psychiatrist, right, as a human. So we're trying to tell this story, both through collecting individual narratives and then putting them together and seeing kind of what is our group narrative. Where have we come from? Where are we going? This, people who practice this profession span, it could span 50 years, right?
Not that I want to tell your story, so I want you to tell your story. Tell me something about the beginning and who you are and where you came from and what it was like in your earlier developmental years.
Well, we could spend an awful lot of time on that, probably weeks, but the short version is this. I am a World War II baby, born and raised in Athens, Greece. I was born at the beginning of World War II. My mother was terrified. By the way, I am a psychiatrist because of my mother. The intragenerational transmission of trauma is what I grew up with, plus my own traumas. So my mother wanted to be a doctor, appropriately so, and rammed that into me. But my inclinations, because I was a very live wire, was to be an actress, a historian, but I knew one thing. I had to leave Greece, no matter what. And my mission was to leave Greece to save my soul. That's how I saw it. My father was 10 years old when his father came to America in Chicago. To this day, I go to Chicago and I always think, what did he do for 15 years? And what he did was, he sent money, to educate the sons and not the one and only daughter. So I'm the beneficiary of all of these hard-earned, painful lessons, very painful lessons. It is very important to understand that what I just told you has taken me 30 years to put together. And this is what I have learned, that it isn't just what you have suffered or what you are now suffering, whether it is adversity or illness, but it is what strengths do you have that makes the difference.
The stories that we will tell about ourselves today will be different next week or different next year. So someone's oral history changes over time, right? And so our goal is to take kind of this like cross section of people's stories at this moment in their lives, but it's really cool to take it in that context of like, you know, you're not just getting facts. In fact, facts are like the least important thing in this. It's just somebody's retelling, you know, of their story, and that it changes over time and depending on where they're at in their life and depending on who they're talking to.
Also talking about like negotiating our goals. Like we come in with our expectations and our goals, what we would like to hear, and then they have their goals and what they're willing to give. Yeah. So just negotiating that would be interesting and kind of worrisome.
So if you YouTube like the history of psychiatry, YouTube psychiatry, a lot of stuff comes up that's just really negative, and it's dark and it's scary and it's ominous. And the art of what we do, like the magic of what we do, is so personal. It's so interpersonal, right? When someone gets better, you have that personal connection. It's not always just the pill.
Especially at the time that I was being trained, our tool as psychiatrists were ourselves. Our reactions, transference, countertransference, how we were responding to the patient, and how we were able to establish effective communication or not.
But one of my biases too, I'm saying it's a bias because I haven't really tested it out. I think a lot of people see me and get better quickly because there's not a lot of this transference shit that people make up. Okay?
What do you mean by that?
By this, I mean, I think we can really talk about issues directly as opposed to going back, tracing shit back to what mom said or did or whatever, but deal more directly in the ongoing transference that's there, which is more palpable and real, I think, to both of us. Sure, I mean, I don't mind sort of helping patients trace things back. With me, I don't see all this terrible negative transference stuff that happens. People come in, they do their therapy, they get better, and they go live their lives. They're not in therapy with me for 50 years.
I think at this point, I like to say that I'm still a psychiatry resident. I'm still in training, so I don't know officially what it feels like to be a psychiatrist yet. I don't let myself think that way. You have to look at each person with an open mind and be ready for where they're going to take you, describing their problems in the session or in the room. It's a challenge. It can be very fun. It can be maybe scary at times, a little bit dangerous.
Sometimes I work in a jail. I work in the women's jail. And sometimes you have to go back 4 or 5 times before someone will even interact with you appropriately without cussing you out or making a racial slur at you or telling you they hate you.
I was actually born in a small town in Douglas, Wyoming. Ended up finishing high school in another small town called Chowchilla. My high school was like 600 kids.
The high school you said you went to, you were one of 3 amongst 600 who went to college?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. You either did one of 2 things. You were either a farmer or you were the owner of a farm. And so you either fit into one of those 2 categories. And maybe if you were lucky, you would go to Fresno State. There wasn't a lot of resources, there wasn't a lot of opportunities. My mom has a 2nd grade education. Actually, I take it back. My dad has a 2nd grade education. My mom has a 6th grade education, which in Mexico, in some communities, that's considered almost like college. A lot of times, I was an interpreter for mom and dad. I guess my dad was gonna lose his job, so the boss wanted me to tell that, explain that to my dad. So you sort of become mature very quickly, yeah. And then just the other day, I had a patient who just disclosed a secret that she had held for like 45 years. Hadn't told anyone, had lived her entire life with this horrible, horrible secret. And she just met me. And within 5 minutes, she was disclosing this. And it was those moments where you feel like, wow, like this is a privilege. This is a privilege, and it's a gift that someone would feel comfortable to tell you that. It sort of gave me, like, it validated like that what we do, what I do is important, and that we do impact people, and we do help people. And a lot of times, like they say, like your patients help you, you know, and in that instance, that's exactly what happened.
I am extremely grateful to my patients for the change that they've brought about in me. I've learned over the years actually to say more or less the right things.
Well, now you've said they changed you, and you've acknowledged the change, but you haven't told us what the change is.
Well, of course, everybody's going to change in their own unique ways. I'm far more relaxed than I used to be. I mean, I'm not saying I don't get anxious. I enjoy life much more. I'm able to enjoy people. I feel more directly connected with people than I used to. Those would be some of the things. I don't want to leave out for a minute the fact that I was in psychoanalysis 4 times a week for about more than 10 years, and then 2 years more twice a week. And then I went once a week basically till my analyst retired. His wife told me I had to quit working, and so he stopped, so I stopped. And that was that.
Back when I trained, we were all encouraged to get our own psychotherapy.
We all have issues. It's just, do we do the work or not?
Yeah. But today, it's not encouraged. It's the rare resident that has their psychodynamic psychotherapy.
Okay, so I was born in San Francisco. I grew up in Nigeria. You know, all the whole 9 years. I can't remember any time that wasn't going to be. I can't remember any time when I wasn't going to be a doctor. So I don't know at what point. I don't know who it was. I don't know what it was. But I do know that I come from, you know, a lot of my maternal side of the family is a lot of healthcare providers. I have a grandmother who my grandmother is in her 90s. She had a father who believed so much in education and allowed her pursue her dreams. And this was like unheard of in her time. Oh, psychiatry, my parents were like, what? Why? How about family medicine? How about everything else, but not psychiatry? Actually, I have a friend, up to the time I got into a fellowship, she was like, oh, really, you're serious about this psychiatry thing?
I had known that I wanted to be a doctor, and I discovered that I wanted to be a psychiatrist while I was in high school. I was reading about hypnosis, which I thought was exciting. And in the library, where the books on hypnosis were, as I went along, the next one was Freud's Psychopathology of Everyday Life. So I read that, and I thought, wow, that's really exciting. I applied to several medical schools, including Harvard, and went up to Boston to find out why I hadn't heard from them. And I was told that they hadn't received any reports from the 2 interviews I had had while I was at Michigan with 2 Harvard graduates. It turns out they had not sent in their report, and apparently they were not interested in having a woman apply. That got straightened out, but by the time Harvard accepted me, I had already visited Montreal and loved it, and so I decided to go to McGill. You know Hans Selye? Very important in the discovery of cortisone. And his wife was a doctor from the US. She was an American. And she had a tea for women who were entering the first year at McGill. And I had never seen a woman doctor before, and so I was imagining that she would be wearing hip boots and carrying a revolver, or, you know, I had all kinds of images, and she was a very sophisticated, good-looking, stylish woman, and that was nice to see.
Did you have strong female role models growing up too?
I didn't have any role models. No. Role models weren't, had not been defined at that time, But no, I didn't have any role models. No women in my family had been professional.
So as soon as I could escape Orange County, I went straight to San Francisco, and I went to college in San Francisco. And there I really, that's really, I think, how I became the person I am now with all of my experiences there. I arrived in San Francisco in the late 1980s, and the AIDS epidemic was raging. And a lot of friends and colleagues were sick and dying, and we didn't have a lot available in terms of resources. And I became very politically active. I became an activist. My whole life changed to one of just social justice. Everything I did was around social justice issues. The other big thing that happened in my life, I think that's led me to this place, is that when my aunt had her first break and I was young, she came to live with us. And she just was an intellectual and a kind person. And she was my hero. And she had schizophrenia. I remember just how I almost wanted her to be off of the medications because she was so weird on the medications, because she was so glossed over and shaky. And as a kid, that looks weird, right? I almost liked her better when she was a little psychotic. Actually, the night that she died, I was at Harbor on a psychiatry shift as a resident. My fellow residents on the shift at the time, I told them what was happening and, a 5-minute story about who she was and what she meant to me. And they just said, "Get out of here, go see her." And I saw her, I said goodbye, and I went back to my shift. But think about that moment. I'm a psychiatrist working in an emergency room. I couldn't help my own aunt. I went to say goodbye to her. She was really the person who put me in the place that I was in as a physician. There was nothing I could do for her. It was really tough. But better to be doing something. I went right back to work.
Yeah, the field of psychiatry has gone through an interesting history. Earlier in the 20th century, it was dominated by the psychoanalysts who had this very, very slow, drawn-out, intensive process that was never really definitively demonstrated to have efficacy. And the model that they were using, I think, was very limited. It was also a model where the analyst was somewhat distanced. It was not a cost-efficient model, even under the best of circumstances. So by the 70s into the 80s, the pharmaceutical industry began to exert more and more influence over the practice of psychiatry. They began to pour money into organizations, psychiatric organizations, into research programs, and basically co-opted the field. But the biological model, as valuable as that treatment can be with some people, and we can see that in our work with patients, it still is limiting. And it's almost distances the psychiatrist too much.
By the late 80s, the handwriting was on the wall with managed care. And suddenly certain patients, they were as if they were plucked away from you after maybe a week in the hospital. It was a shock. Apparently society's only all too ready to pay for very expensive liver transplants or heart transplants or doing quadruple bypasses on people in their 90s. And yet things that could really help people who are much younger with full lives yet to live, that are troubled in many ways, they don't get an opportunity for that kind of support or help.
I grew up in Ohio where my dad's family ran a psychiatric hospital, a private hospital. And it was a family hospital, and my family was the Hardings, and so it was Harding Hospital. And so I grew up across the creek from the hospital. And so psychiatry was a part of every single part of my life. Yeah, I mean, when I was born, we were in Joplin, then they moved to Meningers where my dad did his residency. And he trained there and then took us back to Ohio, and he and his brother and his father and his uncle were all running the hospital. Of course, every once in a while there were some scary things, like my dad would get called and he'd have to go find a patient that had eloped, and so they'd be looking around in the creek or wherever they were, and I always remember kind of waiting and wondering a bit, and then my dad would come home and it'd be okay, and sometimes it wouldn't. But you know, the patients would come to services like at Thanksgiving and Christmas, and we would be in church with them. We would go and eat in the cafeteria, and they would be there. So for me, it was just a part of my life. I think as a young person, I can't ever say that I really had the stigma at all until I was older in life, and I realized that the stigma was there.
Obviously, that we need to get rid of that stigma that mental health is something embarrassing or secretive, or, you know, we're trying to, you know, ruin people's lives with it. I mean, we're really just trying to get people functioning better so they can go out and live their life.
What do you think motivates a person to actually become a psychiatrist?
I think they want to help people like any other doctor, and I think all doctors' intentions, I think, are good, but I think once they enter the medical establishment, they realize that it's a force beyond their control. A good friend of mine goes to Harvard Medical School, and you know, he's in his second year, and he realized that it's more economical to keep a patient sick than to make them better. And I think a lot of medical professionals realize that they're just part of this system that's beyond their control.
I think a lot of people see psychiatrists as like a source of help. I mean, it still is great to talk about your things. A lot of times people get a lot out of it just from, you know, being able to talk about their problems and kind of think through things systematically.
If people have problems, they need someone to talk to. They really do.
Just having someone sit on a couch and have a very specific sort of criteria that they're checking off about somebody's issues or problems. I think trying to pinhole people and label people doesn't necessarily work.
It's really no different than any other job. I mean, a lot of jobs are taking advantage of people to make money. So a business is a business, regardless of if it's, you know, science, or if it's, you know, making movies, or if it's, you know, selling a grocery to somebody at a farmer's market. You know, it's all a business in the end.
There's a tendency in modern medicine to hide behind our machines, hide behind our laboratory assays, but in the end, you know, there are two mortal beings interacting, one in the role of facilitating, providing service, the other in the role of really needing that service provided. And that's where the magic lies.
I mean, I was raised in a home, and you know, our religious beliefs really were in line with that you're only as good as the service that you can provide. If you're not useful, and honestly, both my parents were public servants, if you're not providing a service, like, what are you doing?
Well, I'm very good with bipolars because they are my people. I understand them. You see, I grew up with chaos, and I understand it, and I navigated it, and I survived it. And that's how I came to understand defenses. Defenses are not there to make your life miserable. They're there to help people survive, because the first order of business is survival. You worry about quality of life after you are survived. So that's the way it works.
Yeah, I grew up until the age of 16 in a small town in South Georgia called Bainbridge, Georgia, which at the time was the lynching capital of Southwest Georgia. This was during the days of Jim Crow. So my early education experiences were in separate schools from the schools that white kids went to. So I started off first grade when I was 4 years old. I liked it, stayed there, always the smallest and youngest guy in my class.
This is the 1940s?
This 1951.
51.
Yeah, I was born in 47. My father never liked me. I didn't like him. He had ways of very closely demonstrating that. I learned how to live and get the hell out of there. My mother was afraid of him. Everybody was afraid of him. He's a crazy son of a bitch coming from World War II.
You know, he was in the war?
Yeah.
Fought.
Well, he was in one of the Negro divisions. They did the latrine duties and buried the dead because they didn't feel black people could fight the war, although they had fought in the American Revolution, the Civil War, World War I, etc. Man, I wanted to get the hell out of the South. So I graduated high school at 16. There was a young man who had graduated the year before. I looked up to him, and he went to a school called Morehouse College in Atlanta. Martin Luther King had gone to school there. He went there when he was 16 at Morehouse College, yeah.
You were one of the first psychiatrists and psychoanalysts of color in the country, I think.
Well, there were a couple of older people. When I was in training in psychiatry, we were taught that blacks didn't get depression, for example. This was in textbooks because we had mammies, and these mammies made us immune from mental illness. The notion then that blacks don't need treatment for mental disorders. We didn't have books. So although I couldn't understand what all the words were and nobody could help me with them either, I could get the picture and try to make things up about the picture. And I think that's what life is about. It's about seeing things and making things up out of what you see, to create stories, to create narratives. And then you sort of check them out and see whether they make sense over time. And such is what we do as psychoanalysts, psychotherapists.
I ended up doing 2 years of general surgery residency. That was where I started, but I was very unhappy. I thought, this isn't a lifestyle I can really get on board with, and I don't think I was so amazing at it that I had to be, the world is okay that I'm not a surgeon, it's fine.
And I ended up doing a year of surgery actually at the same hospital here at Harbor.
Went through my rotations and just knew that surgery was not for me.
I would have been a surgeon.
Yeah, I rather thought so.
Really? I don't know how you thought that, but I would have loved being a surgeon.
You're meticulous to detail.
I like detail. I honestly didn't feel my hands were good enough. I also felt I had a bit of a creative spin to me, an imaginative spin to me that wouldn't necessarily have fit that well as a surgeon, but it might have been fine. I never trusted my hands that well. I've never been nimble, a little bit of a trim or a combination of things. I thought, that probably isn't optimal for me.
I had finished school. I went into medical training. After medical training, I went into neurology, and I was very unhappy in neurology. I felt sticking pins in people who could not talk was, it just broke my heart. And there's so little, at least back then, late 70s, early 80s, that you could do in neurology. And then one day, in the Stanford Medical Bookstore, I wandered in, and there on the shelves were Stanislav Grof's first two books, Realms of the Human Unconscious and Human Encounters with Death. And Grob was one of the great researchers of psychedelics, going back to the 50s in Czechoslovakia. I think I read through both of his books in a single weekend, and then I realized I really need to get back to psychiatry, because that was my original goal, going into medical school, to become a psychiatrist, but I had been influenced away. I remember my first day in psychiatry, I went in to see the training director, and he said, "Charles, this is an exciting time for you to enter psychiatry." And I was thinking, yeah, right, psychedelics. We're going to study psychedelics, right? I didn't say that, but that's what I'm thinking. And he said, a wonderful time to go into psychiatry, so exciting. I have here on my desk a copy that was just released, just published last week, of something that'll change the destiny of psychiatry. And he picks up a copy of the DSM-3, and my heart sunk. This is what it's all about? Are you kidding me? So I kept my interest to myself for years and years. And then I've done research, which is now getting a lot of attention, and I feel I'm able to have an impact on the course of our field and in the process, the course of our culture, because I feel that these compounds, if used optimally, under ideal conditions, have great potential to facilitate healing individuals, families, communities, worldwide, if we could only learn how to utilize them as safely and as responsibly as possible.
I am the fifth born in a family of 7, mother, father, and 4 older female siblings. I was the youngest. And that's a very important set of facts. So I grew up essentially in I would say, a female-dominated home, and with a very strong feminizing influence on the children, and particularly the youngest male. So I'm mentioning that because it clearly bespeaks a high potential for conflict and confusion. Okay.
How did that work out for you?
Well, that's the story of my life. This is just going to be a brief interview. We were a left-wing family, and my mother was verbal about it. That, for instance, I know that she wanted me to grow up to be a labor organizer. And I would say, I have a passion for social justice, and I know that this is derived from the parental influence, and particularly in a sort of more focused way from my mother. People function in groups, and that even their individual psychologies will be more profoundly influenced than their current, whether they're rich or poor, by what's embedded in them through identification with parents and the broader culture.
From training as a psychiatrist, how did you end up in psychoanalysis and practicing that for a living?
Well, psychoanalysis was really my subversive interest. Psychiatry was sort of the vehicle for getting to become a psychoanalyst. Because, if you may not be aware of this, but in the United States at that time, psychoanalysis was the exclusive province of medical people.
I hope that psychiatrists continue to want to understand other people, not just diagnose them. A diagnosis is like having a cold. It hardly defines you. Be a whole person with a cold. The whole person is the interesting part of it.
I mean, we talk about mirror neurons and the attunement that comes when people truly are connected. My patients and I know when the tingle, I call it the tingle test, when it starts to happen in the room, when things are really changing, or when they are experiencing incredible connectedness, or they have had an aha experience. I experience it.
It's so critical to have your own imagination and your own creativity engaged with the patient. And that's vitalizing for patient and doctor alike.
That's what's so beautiful about being a psychiatrist, is that it's part of the nature of our work, and I feel part of our obligation is to bring in all of the experiences we've had into what we do.
I was on call on Christmas. This was 6 months into residency. I was on call on a Christmas day. I think it was 10-year-old African-American boy from foster care. I don't remember exactly what the story was, but something about abuse, and he was crying, and I found myself like tearing up, and I was so heartbroken because here I was, it was Christmas morning, I left my kids to go take care of this boy, and my kids were like, "Oh, Mom, you're working, it's Christmas." And then there was this other kid that, it was almost like no one wanted him. Like he was on a psychiatric ward on Christmas morning, and it was just too much. And I had a lot of people who kind of, Dr. Schaepper, who was my program director, also, had a few input at the time. So I kind of started allowing myself process what that would mean. And I think at that point I was also in therapy. I had just, studied psychiatry, and a few supervisors had recommended that it would be good to do some therapy as well, just kind of get more insight about myself and who I was and what I wanted to do. So I then allowed myself go through that, and I got to the conclusion that I possibly wanted to be working with kids, and I've, I guess, over the last 5-6 years, felt that that's my life's work, youth empowerment. I have a very strong belief in God, in meaning, in purpose, in life, and trying to find meaning in all that I do. So I would say for the most part, I'm constantly reflect. I have this. It's almost like I'm constantly aware of what's going on. A sense of, there's been a shift in my peace or my comfort level, or what is it about that person? So that I'm constantly aware of things like that. Because what I find is, of course, sometimes I'm not, and I crash and get into all kinds of trouble. And of course, I have an A-team. I have, my husband, my kids, my parents always stepped up to the plate when I needed to, whatever. Even though my kids would have preferred me to be there at certain times, but that there's always someone there who was covering, sort of, being a good substitute.
My father is a psychiatrist, which is a whole different discussion, I suppose. But having done research with him, having just followed or observed his precedent, all in all being said, I'd always had my major in college was philosophy, having a spiritual sort of inclination, and then this is a spiritual science, and I think it's just not even thinking, just an attraction that pulls you there.
I think psychiatry also needs to acknowledge and recognize that the psychospiritual dimension of individuals' lives are of great import, and traditionally psychiatry tends to lend a deaf ear to that aspect of humanity.
My identity was so, it was just, I was a Harding girl. And when I went to Europe, I was just Marianne. Mm-hmm. And I realized I was the same person. And so at that time, when we decided to get married, I basically, I still had my dream. I was going to do medicine. Mm-hmm. And I found out that I was pregnant, that I had gotten pregnant very early on. But what was happening was I realized that if I was going to have a child, that I wasn't going to do medicine. And so I thought, okay, that dream, that's over. Because I still had the mindset that if you were a mother, and I knew that I was excited about the life that was growing in me. So there was two things going on. It was like my dream was going and my child was coming. But what I didn't realize that myself was coming with that child. So at age 36, I started medical school.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
After so much.
My friends thought I was crazy. My kids were in 5th and 6th grade. Mm-hmm. I was crazy. And it was the best thing in the world.
The first child is the result of the fruit of the benefit of psychoanalysis, because I had 5 miscarriages before him. You see, the traumas at the beginning of my life and the repetitions thereafter screwed up my pituitary adrenal axis. So I had to feel secure before I could carry a pregnancy.
Sounds like you know a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder, science and research.
Well, I'm a poster child, and the word is it's treatable. But you need a container. Without my husband and my family and my profession, I wouldn't be here. The biggest award I've ever gotten is my middle son, who is now getting a degree as a counselor in mental health. He said to me, "Mom, you are no longer crazy." I passed. I passed. That's it. I got certified.
I never thought I'd be a mom. I never thought I'd have a child, ever. And that's really changed me. Everything that I was able to kind of swim by, even as a care provider, because I had my daughter in residency, it impacts me so much more deeply now. It's like a part of my heart just really is now totally raw and exposed. And that's what motherhood did to me. And that opportunity I never thought I had. I'm not straight. I didn't think I'd ever be in a traditional relationship where I would have a child. I thought maybe, I might adopt a teenager at some point, who was in need. But I just never thought I'd have my own child. That was the biggest surprise. And then all of the changes, it really makes you different.
I was about 14 or 15, and far enough back that we still read the Saturday Evening Post. And there was an interview there of, I think, two of the Menninger brothers. They talked about, what it's like being a psychoanalyst in Topeka at that very distinguished Menninger Foundation. And one of the things on the second page was, what does it take to be a psychoanalyst? You want to be interested in history, you want to be interested in science, you want to be interested in literature, you want to be interested in poetry, politics for sure. And it was a list of things, and I looked at that and I thought, I think that's who I am. I think I'm that curious about a lot of things in the world that this would match well with the way my mind works and what I would be most interested in spending my life doing. And so that was my compass heading there, was to be a psychoanalyst at that very tender age. That set the course of a life there, really. And my life, as much as anything, has been organized around how the mind works and working with people to help them understand their own mind, not to mention understand more about how my mind works. And the reality is you can't really help people in this field unless you let your mind merge to some degree in experience with the people you're treating.
My own life experience is a copious, abundant, and endless resource, because I feel that it's very important to start identifying immediately with the patient, and out of that to have some activation of my own impinging narrative theme. And that is what I call the subordinated subjectivity of the therapist.
When I'm working with people, I use a lot of stories, because growing up in the South, the truth is very difficult to apprehend, but a story, you can get across information to people. I guess Christians would call that like telling a parable or something of that sort. So that's something that's really helped me a lot in being able to understand the human condition and to present it in terms of small vignettes, more akin to Aesop's fables or something of that sort. And I think that helps open people up.
That's the thing, you have to get sometimes a little creative with your patients, because they're not going to fit into, sort of a cookie cutter mold of what medicine should be or what the doctor-patient interaction should be. So sometimes I work with some young adults, and sometimes with them, like, they can't even tolerate sitting in the office because they're too anxious or it's just too clinical for them. So sometimes you just be like, let's just go for a walk. We'll just do this session on a walk if you're okay with it, I think I have a very casual style, so sort of the way I talk to patients is just like I would talk to almost like a friend without, sharing stuff about myself, but like, dude, what were you doing? Why are you doing that? What's going on? You know, tell me what's happening with you. And sometimes that can work.
The key element is reinstilling a sense of purpose and meaning. And we found this also with the subjects in our research study who had advanced metastatic cancer, who were close to death. We treated them with psilocybin session, one session, moderate dose, and it really facilitated a reconnected to who they were, which they had lost in the throes of the crisis of the illness. I had a series of remarkable experiences in the Brazilian Amazon when we were conducting our study, and ayahuasca was the topic of our study, and in a religious context it was government sanctioned, so we were invited to participate in ceremonies. You know, I think it would have been very rude to say no. You know, so I participated in ceremonies, and they were extraordinary. You know, just having these you know, powerful psycho-spiritual experiences, having heart-opening experiences, also gaining insight into my dynamics, the dynamics of my life, those around me, and tremendous inspiration to continue the work, both with the research as well as a healer, as a doctor, as a psychiatrist. I think it really helped me access more of my potential. At this point in my life, I'm kind of quasi-retired from being that adventuresome, but the memories are there, and that experience is still within, and I can kind of reconnect to it. That's it, that's right. That's the path, that's what I need to keep focusing on.
The role of love is crucial in all of this. That the glue and the engine that promotes both organization and function is the process of human love. Now, I didn't invent this. I mean, I can mention, and this is a controversial figure, Martin Heidegger. But, you know, Heidegger said, we are born, we are thrown into relationship. We are heading to death, but what saves us from instant grim depression is relationship. The relational bonds and processes are, I would say, based on loving potentials and actualities. So that love is crucial. A loving self emerges under favorable circumstances. One could say that the therapeutic process, in my opinion, is the progressive emancipation of the loving self.
Tell us, when did that accident actually occur? Or tell me.
Well, it happened on a Friday afternoon on May 16th, 2008, like I said, right out in front of the building here. I was crossing the street on a Friday afternoon. I pushed the walk button. The traffic on Wilshire had stopped. I was in the crosswalk, and there's that like electronic countdown. It was going 17, 16, 15. And I said, the sense something was coming at me. I looked to my left, and here a motorist was coming up Westgate, about to make a left turn to go west on Wilshire, and did not see me clearly. And I had no idea my mind worked this quickly, but these are the things that happened in a split second. You don't have time to go forward, you don't have time to go backwards. If this car hits you, you're going to get thrown like 50 feet, and it could be the end of you. You've got one play here. I threw myself up on the hood of the car, and kaplawi.
And what did the person say? Did you ever hear them apologize? Or?
Well, I did actually, which is rather sad, rather poignant. As I'm laid out on the sidewalk, there's a semicircle of people formed around me. It was like 3 or 4, there must have been 50 people. I'm not exaggerating at all. It was Friday afternoon, a lot of foot traffic, and people are yelling all kinds of things. Don't give up. Somebody yells out, "You're gonna live, you're gonna live."
Oh yeah, that's nice.
And I'm just laying there, and within no time at all, I could hear the whine of the paramedics, you know, the siren coming. But then, from one of the back ranks, "Oh my God, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it. I didn't see you. It was a woman, you know, probably in her 50s, who was completely distraught. You know, she was the driver of this vehicle. And I already, even then, as bad officer, I was like, oh my God, this lady's in bad shape. And yeah, so that was my apology, and it was heartfelt. So I had a pretty good recovery. I had a first-hand experience of post-traumatic stress, though. I went through these periods where I'd have like, it was like surges of anxiety. My heart would start beating and I'd start sweating, and anytime I got near an intersection where I was crossing as a pedestrian, my head was on a swivel that wouldn't stop. Yeah, and then I got depressed for a while, and I went through this kind of crazy line of thinking, like, you know, maybe somebody is out to get me, or maybe that's a little paranoid, or how about the depressive side, maybe I deserved it. I mean, and I'm thinking, oh my God, you're having these thoughts, this is insane.
I was very clear. I was coming to do psychiatry, and I was clear that I was going to go back to Ohio to our home hospital. And during my medical school studies, we emerged with Ohio State University, and in essence, the Harding Hospital became part and parcel of Ohio State University. And so I really didn't have a home to go back to. So that all changed. And when I was at UCLA doing my fellowship, my father was actually recruited to come to Loma Linda. And so the thought that, I would never be able to work with my family, all of a sudden became an opening here at Loma Linda. I think coming and working with my father, it was actually having the language that he spoke. I learned French, I learned German. I could speak to French, I could speak to German people. But what was George? What was psychiatrist George and the men in my life? What was their language? And I think that working with my father, I learned, and I was fluent and started learning that language. So that experience was priceless.
I think all of us go into psychiatry for a reason. We like the quirkiness of people and, you know, the sort of offbeat kinds of conversations you might run into. I think it's made me less judgmental, and I think it also makes you more humble, because no matter what your problems are in your life, they're relative. I think in other specialties, you know, the doctor can be almost, you know, more friendly with the patient, and it wouldn't be as strange to talk about your personal life, you know, in a doctor-patient interaction. But with us, there has to be that space, but without being a completely blank slate like they used to teach us to do. But if there's one tiny bit of humanity or, you know, some personal info, I think it can just help the patient trust you. It can let them know, you know, you have more going on than just what's in the office.
It was discouraged. You weren't allowed to hug your patient.
Yeah.
Shake hands sometimes.
Don't ever touch. Yeah, no touching.
No touching.
Right.
Touching is so important.
Touching is so important.
Touching is so important. Can you imagine a patient is doing this?
Yeah.
And you say, I'm not allowed to shake hands?
Right.
There goes everything. You might as well just hang up your coat. And you know, you and I trained together, and we remember that little back room. That back room is so important to my own sanity. Yeah. That's where we all connect, as because our jobs are hard, and the things that we see are traumatic.
I wouldn't say the most unexpected, but the most startling, I mean, has been like patient suicide. That's something to deal with. We know that someone with their first break of schizophrenia is going to be high risk for suicide. Well, we've learned that over time. We've learned that from just scientific method, looking at cases, getting the properties that are similar, and understanding that. So that being said, I feel like the training program has done an incredible job of preparing for that type of thing. You know, when you take on a certain case that's sort of high risk, emotionally knowing what's going to happen ahead of time, what the possibilities are, really made that particular situation, dealing with it, so much easier and better than if it was kind of like, well, that's a bad outcome and you know, c'est la vie or whatever. It was prophylactically treated. You know, we knew about it, and it doesn't take away from the pain of losing someone. It doesn't take away from that. So, you know, it was not easy. The criticisms afterwards can sort of make people feel very scared to take on patients like this again, the litigious nature of things, and coping with that can be difficult. You know, someone comes into your office with depression, they're going to be suicidal for a long time. And if you write that down, you know, someone's going to say, well, why they were suicidal before they came in your office, you know, and why didn't you do anything? And so there's this, I mean, I don't know, as a resident, I'm a little bit protected, but I could imagine you're kind of like a lot more worried when your patient dies. It's a lot more rare event, and you have this close relationship with them, and people don't even know what you're doing in that room, therapy-wise. It could, you know, it can be a lot more controversial. It shouldn't be, though, and I don't think it really is. And I think that that part of that has to do with sort of the stigmas related to psychiatry in the sort of non-scientific community.
Do you think psychologists are different from psychiatrists?
Not really. I mean, I feel like both of them, you know, obviously one could prescribe medicine, but I feel like both of them can, if you can't prescribe it, you can at least convince somebody to prescribe it, or to want to need it, or, you know, they'll do the follow-up to, you know, go on WebMD or do the Google searches and then say, all right, well, I need to find someone that can get me, like, a drug or something like that.
I guess I would be afraid going to one that medication could be prescribed too quickly without exploring other avenues, because I definitely prefer to not use medication, so I guess I'm a little afraid of it. But otherwise, I definitely think it's necessary and something some people do need.
I have a cousin of mine. She's like a sister to me, and we grew up together. And you know, maybe about a couple of years ago, she had some serious mental health breakdowns, and she was diagnosed as bipolar, schizophrenic. And I guess I was very upset that she was given this huge drug cocktail. But I noticed some positive changes in her life. She started to sound like the person that I grew up with. But now I realize that she's relied too heavily on the drugs. And when they're not working, she really doesn't have someone to talk to about it, you know? I've never heard her talk about the person, if there's a person she really talks to. I never heard her mention it in a human way. It's more like, the doctors give me these pills for anxiety, this pill makes me go to sleep, this pill keeps the voices out of my head. I've never heard her talk about the person behind the counter, behind the desk.
Every single person that comes into my office, like I say, in honoring myself, I'm going to honor them. I'm going to do my absolute very best. And I'm going to also be willing to say, I'm not the doctor for you. When they come in and they say to me, Doc, I want this and this and this, and just give me a script and I'm out of here kind of thing, that is fine. It's not what I can do for you.
Well, since medication has become so important, it's an entirely different field. I don't think I would go into psychiatry today. I think medication is wonderful when it works. I'm fascinated with what's going on in the chemistry in the brain, but I'm not interested in providing medication, except very simple medication.
The growing perception that psychiatrists are simply there to write prescriptions is troubling, I find. I mean, our medications can, with some people, be of great help, but there ought to be more to the work than just writing scripts.
First place, mind and brain are integrated. I mean, I don't think you can ever
Correct.
think of them as polarized. And it's a bidirectional influence that they have. Mind clearly affects brain structure, and brain structure clearly affects mind and how mind functions. I mean, just the fact that I prescribe medications for people that I work intensively with psychodynamically, I'm tipping my hat there to the biology of the brain, and continue to believe that's an important part of what we have to offer.
So what you're saying to the younger psychiatrists would be you must have a good found knowledge of the science for your prescribing.
I would say so, absolutely.
What else?
I would also say to those people, I hope that isn't all you do. I cannot fathom a career where I just had people coming in a line out the door for maybe 10 or 15-minute meetings after the initial one, where there are med management meetings. I just can't even imagine what that would be like. I think my imagination would pass away. I wouldn't want that.
And then what do you think it would be like to actually be a psychiatrist?
I think that a psychiatrist would actually need a psychiatrist, because after hearing all the stuff that they have to hear,
a lot of psychiatrists are sort of held either held up as like somebody that's unapproachable or somebody that's evil, and it's got to be hard.
You tell someone you're a psychiatrist at a bar, you know, they run from you. It's like, you know, you're on fire or something. You know, people are like, I don't want to talk to you, bye. Or they tell you everything about their life story that you didn't want to know, you know.
Well, it used to be, oh, you can see into my mind. That idea seemed to be very prevalent, that I was seeing into their mind, or that I would want to.
I think that people think I know a lot that I don't know. I think people think I'm smarter than I am, first of all. And I think that they assume that we know so much about human behavior and interaction, and they can ask us questions like, why do people do this? Or why does this happen? And you're like, well, I don't know. I have no idea.
There's a humility to the, I think, underlying, sometimes physicianly grandiosity. There's a deeper stratum, I think, of humility. Look at the jokes. What's the definition of a psychiatrist? A Jewish doctor who's afraid of the sight of blood. Now, there's a core of humility, a sense of the limitations that we humans have, which I think gives us a more sharp-edged judgment. If we know our limits, if we recognize our weaknesses, we're more likely to be effective in formulating our approach.
For me, what's worked for me, and I think it might work for others, is facing your fears. I think the more you face your fears, the easier it becomes to feel comfortable with yourself, and it becomes easier to challenge yourself and to do things that help build who you are and build your self-esteem and build your ability to be an individual. And it's not easy, because it's a lot of times easier to sort of walk away from what's scary or unknown, like this interview. But
So I started doing some comedy stuff. Did you not know this? I didn't tell you this? Oh, I never told you that? Oh, this is great. Okay, so 4th year of residency, I was chief resident. I had a little more time. So I decided I'm kind of boring. I need to find myself again, and just the old things I used to like to do. It was 3 hours of laughter therapy a week. But I got into a comedy show last summer, and it was on for the whole summer, and it was really fun, and I did it, Monday nights for a couple months, and I mean, it was awesome. It was so much fun, and I think comedy is pain in a strange way, and a lot of people who are very good comedians are pretty serious depressives, and they have a lot of really good psych-minded, they're very psychologically oriented, and they really kind of understand the human condition.
But one thing I've come to understand is that life is so complex. If you try to find a formula for it, you have to be prepared to have mud in your face over and over. I think just having an openness to experience and not being too afraid of it and not being too afraid of being wrong.
I mean, it's beginning to seep in that there is no life without mental health. It's beginning. Okay, so my dream, devise an approach to educate about mental health in all of its complexity to the leaders of all countries. Mandatory education. The moment you become a president, you have to take that fucking course and have a practicum.
I'm very hopeful about psychiatry. I wish I could be around for another 100 years to see the immense changes as we recognize more and more about brain function and develop therapies similar to the ones that Freud talked about, that we can use more directly to what the issue is and how we can get it to work for that specific patient or patients instead of just throwing one therapy at everything.
Do the right thing. Do the right thing that are in accord with your values. Do the right thing that will benefit those around you, and do service, do justice to yourself and your own lineage. Do the right thing in honor of your ancestors. I'm very connected to the concept of ancestors. You do enough hallucinogens and you study the cultures from whence they came, you appreciate that in many respects this is ancestor medicine. It allows you to connect to generations that preceded you.
And there needs to be a human population that has a sophisticated, loving attitude towards other human beings, not just their own narrow circle, with an awareness of Mother Earth's need for loving care. And while this is a huge task, and I'm pessimistic about whether it can be effectively addressed, I think that there is an urgent need for psychotherapy on a much broader scale.
So I definitely want to do some psychiatric work in Nigeria. I think it was Dr. Byron that told me that there are 4 child psychiatrists in Nigeria. Yeah, and I mean, Nigeria is always going to be home, you know. So the idea that we have 4 child psychiatrists, I think our population now is, I don't know how many billion. Yeah. One thing with a lot of the developing world is just this whole notion that you want food handed out to you, or manna handed out to you, for lack of a better word. But just moving from that mindset to the mindset of I can, I'm able, you know. So that's what I thought. That's what I really loved about this whole idea of training the young adults to then do the support themselves. So essentially, you're saying you're able. You have what it takes within your community to do what, you know, to take care of your problem versus, oh, we're gonna send you aids like everybody else has done, all the governments, and they have good intentions. But I think that the shift should be, okay, you are able.
I think, you know, the media has hurt us a lot, just in different TV shows and different movies, has given us, you know, kind of a bad name in the media.
I think that part of the stigma that we have is one of stoicism, that we're removed, that it's sterile, that we don't get personally involved, that we really don't even know who many of our patients are. I mean, to be fair, in managed care psychiatry, that is actually the case. You don't really know, you forget.
And that's part of the stigma too, is that a lot of people think that psychiatrists are just trying to make them into one thing, to make them well, or to make them not have voices, to lose their personality. If I take this medicine, I'm gonna lose who I am. And that's not true, because we're trying to actually work with the choices and their freedom to make them the best that they wanna be. And I think that's a misconception of psychiatrists, that we're trying to make them like everyone else. If anything, we value individuality. I think out of anyone.
What was unexpected that you learned from this process? Like, what about us and what about you?
It's amazing how many of us are so similar.
Mm-hmm.
The similarities are incredible. I always thought I was much more different, so that changed me in a large way.
Oh.
I just can't believe how similar. Yeah. I guess I was a little paranoid.
Many of the people we interviewed, they were kind of fueled by their own personal traumas to go into the field.
And seeing that in other people was really comforting, of like, wow, like, I'm not that special in a really good way, you know, like, oh, my trauma or my like hardship, like, really isn't that special. It's part of what makes me like everybody else and not unlike everybody else.
I really liked what Kristen was talking about with touch, because I think, like, I totally agree with you, the theme of love is very important, and I think there's a stigma with love that love is sexuality.
Right.
And a lot of psychiatrists are afraid of touch and afraid to say love and afraid to cry and afraid to have this kind of
Right.
like human interaction with people because of the dark history that psychiatry has. And now we're like super regulated, there's a lot of supervision, and we're still, I think, to this day, we still live with that dark history. We're so careful with the way we interact with patients. And I really like how she talked about that, because it also distances us from our patients. And when we get more human, when we're able to use terms like love and to cry and to touch, that's when we can be effective.
I feel like with my generation, there's less religion, but there's more spiritual.
Yeah, and that's me too.
Yeah, and so
just because you don't believe in a higher power doesn't mean that you can't still be spiritual.
Yeah.
I mean, we all have numinous experiences. We all have experiences of things that are beyond us.
We're probably in a minority, but I agree. To me, spirituality is a mainstay of what I do as a psychiatrist. I couldn't function without it.
When I hear the older guys saying like, oh, you know, the newer generation isn't getting therapy, they're not, you know, they're doing the biological model, blah, 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 blah.
I don't agree.
I don't see it that way. I see us as like, we're taking it to a whole other level. Like, we're taking it way even beyond.
How has being a psychiatrist changed you?
Well, it's made me much more patient. Things go slowly. Changes come slowly. I hope it has made me more thoughtful. I hope it has made me more conscious of what goes on unspoken and under the surface.
I think the positive impact has been that I really appreciate life.
I think I've become more humble. I think I've come to realize there's a lot about human beings I don't know and don't understand. I try. Sometimes I'm successful in trying to understand. A lot of times I'm not. But the thing that keeps me hopeful is that we keep trying to understand each other, and bit by bit, usually we do come to some clearing there.
The only answer really is to help to facilitate a reawakening and a motivation to reconnect, and a realization of the value of human connectedness and connectedness to the planet.